On August 30th, 1945, Tokyo's urban landscape bore little resemblance to streets. Instead, the city was a desolate expanse of ash, solidified into fragile crusts that cracked underfoot. This mournful terrain was intermittently broken by the fire-scarred skeletons of homes where laughter had once resonated. A spectral presence in the hazy distance, the imperial palace stood, its moats mirroring a sky devoid of any joyous celebration, a stark testament to the recent capitulation. Just under 2 weeks following Emperor Hirohito's somber radio address announcing Japan's surrender, American soldiers made their initial entry into the devastated capital. For countless Japanese civilians, this arrival portended a grim future, a prelude to inevitable humiliation, savage violence, or even more profound atrocities. After all, their formative years had been filled not with comforting tales of benign spirits, but with chilling narratives of merciless Americans, poised to inflict indiscriminate slaughter. Yet, as military jeeps advanced through the smoke-tinged atmosphere, the figures emerging were startlingly incongruous with their fears. They were not horned devils, but rather sun-baked men, perspiring in their khaki uniforms, clumsily fanning themselves with their helmets. Their pockets bulged with items that shimmered tantalizingly: chocolate bars, cans of Spam, and packets of chewing gum. The initial shock, a quiet, almost imperceptible tremor, first registered in the eyes of the city's children. Barefoot and hollow-eyed, some clad in tattered rags fashioned from old futons, these children observed from shadowy alleys where the wind whipped dust into their hair. Their mothers instinctively pulled them back, faces rigid with an ancient fear. Older men murmured under their breath, expressing deep-seated disgrace and the profound shame of witnessing enemy soldiers parade unchallenged through the very heart of the empire. But hunger, a more primal force, soon eclipsed fear. Eyes once trained solely on hatred now fixed upon the Americans' bulging packs, their curiosity outweighing suspicion. One boy, whose ribs were sharply defined beneath his thin cotton shirt, dared a whisper to his sister, "Do you think they truly eat all that?" The grim reality was that civilians anticipated the absolute worst. Since 1937, Japan's state-controlled media had relentlessly portrayed Americans as barbaric monsters. Posters depicted GIs as demonic figures with knives clenched between their teeth. Mothers instilled in their children the belief that capture by Americans meant certain death. Even in the war's final days, terrifying rumors spread like wildfire. Americans would poison wells, enslave families, and raze every temple and shrine to the ground. Yet what rolled into the city was strangely mundane. Not demons or conquerors wielding flaming torches, but tired young men, some barely older than the children watching them, their rifles slung loosely, exchanging uneasy glances at the profound devastation surrounding them. One soldier scrawled in his journal that day, "Tokyo looks like a moonscape. I thought I'd be hated, maybe killed. Instead, they just stare at us. Kids everywhere. Too many kids too hungry." Hunger, indeed, became the pivotal axis around which this unexpected encounter revolved. By late 1945, daily rations had plummeted below 1,500 calories per person. Rice, the foundational element of the Japanese meal, was desperately scarce. People resorted to foraging for weeds, acorns, and even sawdust to supplement their meager meals. Children collapsed in schools from sheer weakness, their growth stunted by malnutrition. Black markets flourished like mushrooms in back alleys, but only those with existing connections could participate in trade. For the vast majority, each day was a desperate negotiation with emptiness. When the Americans appeared, it was as if mobile storehouses of unimaginable abundance had stumbled into a desolate wasteland. And then, the unthinkable occurred. Instead of barking orders or seizing property, a young American private, his helmet seeming too large for his head, halted his jeep. He crouched down and, with an almost hesitant gesture, offered a chocolate bar to a small girl clutching a broken doll. The girl's mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She had been taught these men would target children first. Instead, she watched her daughter hold the bar like a sacred relic, inhaling its sweet, unfamiliar scent before daring a tiny bite. Her eyes widened, mesmerized. She had never tasted anything quite like it. Her light, nervous giggle drifted across the silent street. That singular moment ignited a quiet revolution, spreading through whispers like wildfire. American soldiers were giving food. Not stealing it, not hoarding it, but pressing cans and bars into the outstretched hands of children. Soon, other GIs emulated the act. Powdered milk was ladled into chipped bowls. Gum was unwrapped for small, eager mouths. Spam was sliced and distributed, even if no one quite knew how to prepare it. The oppressive air of dread fractured, replaced by stunned disbelief. Mothers wept in silence, torn between overwhelming gratitude and profound humiliation. Fathers averted their faces, ashamed that their family's survival might now hinge on the benevolence of their former enemies. But the children, ever the truest barometers of reality, did not hesitate. They ate. They chewed gum until it tangled in their hair. They licked chocolate from their fingers, their eyes wide at a sweetness they had never known. For them, ideology melted quicker than sugar on the tongue. The soldiers, perhaps relieved to discover that feeding children was simpler than confronting them on a battlefield, laughed softly. And in that fragile laughter, something fundamental shifted. Of course, this sight was not universal. In the same city, bitter voices still echoed. "Shameful!" an old man muttered as he watched his neighbor's boy run past with a Hershey bar. "We bow to them now, even for food." Yet even he could not entirely ignore the glow on the child's face. Hunger is a ruthless teacher, imparting pragmatism faster than pride. For the Americans, the act was a blend of instinct and nascent policy. Official relief efforts under General MacArthur's Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP, would require time to organize. Bulk shipments of wheat and powdered milk would not arrive for months. But individual soldiers carried rations, and individual soldiers noticed children. It was simpler to hand out food than to explain occupation. Easier to elicit a smile than to manage a pervasive silence. Perhaps, too, it was a way for them to reaffirm their own humanity after years of killing. The civilians did not know it yet, but this simple act would ripple outward. What began as scattered gifts of chocolate and gum would evolve into formalized food aid, comprehensive school lunch programs, and a fundamental reshaping of daily Japanese diets. Yet in that moment no one contemplated policy. They thought only of gnawing hunger and the unimaginable sight, an enemy bending low to feed a child. By dusk that day, word had spread throughout Tokyo's shattered ruins. The Americans had not come solely with guns. They had also brought food. Children relayed it to other children. Mothers whispered it to neighbors. Fear did not vanish, but it fractured. And through that crack seeped something Japan had not felt in months, perhaps even years. Not trust, not yet, but a burgeoning curiosity. As the sun sank behind the broken skyline, an American jeep paused near a small shrine that still stood, its roof partially caved from firebombing. A soldier climbed down, a can of milk powder in his hand. Dozens of children surrounded him, their eyes wide, not with terror, but with eager expectation. He offered a somewhat awkward smile and extended the can. Somewhere nearby, a bell tolled, solemn and strange. In that sound was the immense weight of surrender, the ache of hunger, and the whisper of something almost inconceivable. That an empire brought to its knees might find its first taste of recovery, not in victory or vengeance, but in a spoonful of foreign food. And what those children would soon discover was that this was only the very beginning. The taste of chocolate was not just sweetness. For many Japanese children in 1945, it was the inaugural moment they realized life might unfold differently from what they had been relentlessly told. In the narrow lanes of Osaka, where smoke still drifted from bomb-blackened walls, a small boy named Haruo sat on a step, holding a square of Hershey's. He had been indoctrinated with the belief that Americans were merciless beasts. But the square melted in his mouth with a flavor he simply could not reconcile with the word enemy. His mother, watching from behind, tightened her hands into fists. Gratitude arrived hand in hand with shame, and shame became inextricably linked with survival. In that intense tension, the entire nation found its own reflection. Food, surprisingly, became the battlefield of perception. The Americans, for their part, carried rations filled with various curiosities. Tinned Spam that gleamed pink and slick, powdered milk sealed in tins, and chewing gum that utterly baffled grandmothers who assumed it must be swallowed whole. To the starving civilians, these items seemed almost mythical. To the soldiers, they were ordinary, even disposable. This vast disparity of meaning orchestrated a quiet, poignant theater on Japan's streets. Soldiers casually handed out goods with the relaxed air of men who possessed an abundance. Civilians received them with the reverence of those who possessed nothing. The contrast was most striking in the faces of children. Oral histories recount one particular girl, barely 8, who took a piece of gum from a Marine and held it aloft like a precious jewel. She chewed until its sweetness faded, then meticulously tucked the wad behind her ear to preserve it, returning to it later as though it were pure gold. Such moments spread through hushed whispers, gradually softening the harsh images propaganda had burned deep into the national consciousness. "They are not monsters," one boy muttered to his sister. "Monsters do not give candy." The statistics starkly underscored the desperation. By the end of 1945, Japan was importing less than half the food it had consumed before the war. Calorie intake for civilians plunged below subsistence levels. Adults frequently fainted at work, and children's bellies swelled ominously with hunger. Relief shipments under SCAP began to arrive, but widespread distribution was a slow process. In that critical interim, the sight of GIs handing out personal rations carried a weight far heavier than the items themselves. In cities like Yokohama and Nagoya, soup lines began to appear, where powdered milk was whisked into steaming bowls and poured into hands cupped with chipped porcelain. Some children gagged at the unfamiliar flavor, yet drank it anyway, the warmth filling stomachs long accustomed to emptiness. Still, acceptance was complicated. Parents stood at a distance, their faces etched with unease. To accept food from the enemy was to admit a profound dependence. One Osaka mother later recalled, "I cried when my son drank the milk. I wanted him to live, but I felt our pride dissolve." Pride was a fragile commodity in those months, and every act of relief threatened to shatter it further. Still, starvation forced impossible choices. Children harbored fewer doubts, and in their raw eagerness, the cracks of reconciliation widened. American soldiers, too, felt the profound strangeness of the situation. One GI, interviewed decades later, vividly remembered the intense weight of a boy's eyes as he handed him a can of Spam. "He looked at me like I was giving him the world. Back home, Spam was a joke. But there, it was treasure. I think that's when I realized what we'd done to this country." The irony was piercing. Food mocked as low-class back in the States became a potent symbol of mercy in occupied Japan. Humor, surprisingly, crept in despite the gravity. In one Tokyo neighborhood, a grandmother boiled Spam for hours, assuming it was raw pork, and then complained that it simply dissolved into mush. Another family tried to fry powdered milk into patties, only to scrape the burnt mess off their pan with disappointment. Such stories, though small, reveal the awkward merging of two vastly different worlds. The gifts were not merely nourishment but cultural encounters, moments when misunderstanding occasionally gave way to laughter or frustration, but always left a trace of human contact. Children's testimonies from those years are particularly vivid. A boy recalled the shock of tasting real sugar for the first time, his tongue aching from the sudden sweetness. A girl remembered clutching her first candy bar, afraid to eat it, terrified it would vanish too quickly. When she finally took a bite, She said it was like eating light. To them, these were not just treats. They were tangible evidence that the enemy carried something other than firebombs. Yet the central conflict remained. How could a nation reconcile images of death with gestures of kindness? Hiroshima and Nagasaki were still wounds so raw that survivors flinched at the sight of any American face. Tokyo's ruins whispered of the March firebombing, when over 100,000 people had perished in a single night. To take chocolate from the very hands that had dropped napalm was almost unthinkable. And yet it happened. Every bite contained a profound contradiction, bitterness and sweetness tangled into one. By late autumn, the informal handouts began to echo official relief efforts. In schools, teachers lined up children for steaming ladles of soup thickened with U.S. wheat. Laughter gradually crept back into courtyards where silence had long reigned. Still, some children remembered the shame more vividly than the taste. One boy recalled hiding his chocolate bar under his shirt so no one would see him eating it. Another said he ate with his back to his mother, too ashamed to let her witness his pleasure. For the soldiers, these moments offered relief of another kind. The war had hardened them, stripped them of innocence. To kneel before children and hand out food was to reclaim something they feared had been irrevocably lost. One Marine confessed, "I wanted to prove to myself I wasn't just a killer. The chocolate, the milk, the gum, these were symbols not only for the Japanese, but for the Americans themselves, markers of humanity surviving the wreckage of war." Still, the gap between gesture and trust remained wide. Many civilians wondered aloud if the gifts were mere tricks, ways to lull them into complacency before cruelty resumed. Others questioned if poison lay hidden in the powder. Distrust lingered, as deeply rooted as hunger itself. And yet, as days turned into weeks, the gifts continued, steady and unthreatening, until doubt began to slowly erode. Children who had once flinched at the sight of soldiers now chased their jeeps, waving for candy. Soldiers, once perceived as destroyers, became givers of strange delicacies. The paradox was almost too much to comprehend. In the rubble of a war that had shattered families and reduced cities to ash, a square of chocolate or a spoonful of milk became more than mere sustenance. They became symbols of survival, gestures that forced both sides to perceive each other differently. The Japanese learned that the enemy had hands that could feed as well as fists that could strike. The Americans discovered that victory did not conclude with conquest, but with the fragile act of helping the defeated live another day. By the winter of 1945, the whispers had solidified into cautious acknowledgement. The Americans were not solely occupiers. They were also, strangely, feeders. And though the bitterness of loss lingered like smoke, the sweetness of chocolate began to compete with it in memory. But what those families did not yet realize was that these small gifts were only the beginning. Food was about to become a weapon of peace, wielded not on battlefields, but in schoolyards and kitchens, meticulously reshaping a nation's future, meal by painstaking meal. The ruins of Japan were not just physical. They were emotional landscapes, crumbled as thoroughly as the brick and timber of its cities. Tokyo, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Yokohama, Osaka, all bore scars that could not be swept clean in a single season. Nearly 9 million people were left homeless in the closing months of 1945, living in makeshift shelters constructed from corrugated tin, tarps, and salvaged boards. Winter's cruel bite pierced through walls that scarcely existed. Children slept with empty bellies, and adults fought off the debilitating weakness of malnutrition that dulled both body and spirit. Into this profound devastation came the occupying force, its uniforms crisp, its jeeps intact, its supplies seemingly abundant. The stark contrast was lost on no one. General Douglas MacArthur, the towering figure who oversaw occupation policy, insisted in his early directives that famine must be prevented at all costs. He understood precisely what his men witnessed with their own eyes. Starving people could not be governed. "Give them food," he wrote in dispatches, "and we will earn more than obedience." We will earn a chance for peace. His words filtered down into practical, tangible acts. American wheat arrived by the ton. Milk powder was stacked high in warehouses. And plans were set in motion for school lunch programs that could reach millions of children. Relief organizations joined the effort: CARE, the Red Cross, church missions, all funneling precious calories into a country where mere survival had become a daily, desperate negotiation. But the grand numbers tell only part of the story. On the ground, the exchanges were deeply human, often awkward, and frequently tinged with both pride and shame. A father in Yokohama stood in line at a soup kitchen where American flour had been baked into rough loaves of bread. He tore off a piece for his son, but when the boy innocently asked, "Will you eat, too?" the father simply shook his head and offered a weak smile. Later, in an oral history, that boy recalled, "I realized then my father had not eaten for days." Survival was measured not in calories alone, but in sacrifices silently made. The humiliation of dependence weighed heavily. Men who had once marched proudly for the empire now queued behind their children, bowls clutched in hand. One recalled his profound unease. "I fought against them in the Pacific. Now I take bread from them. Feels like defeat twice over." Pride bent under the crushing weight of hunger, yet still resisted breaking entirely. In many neighborhoods, parents forbade children to show too much eagerness when given food, fearing it would make them appear as beggars. Children outwardly obeyed, but their eyes frequently betrayed them. American soldiers, meanwhile, were caught in their own set of contradictions. Some had fought in brutal battles, losing friends to Japanese fire. Now they were ladling soup or handing out candy to the children of those very same enemies. A Marine who had survived Iwo Jima wrote to his wife, "It's the damnedest thing. I thought I'd never look at a kid without hate. But today I gave a little girl a chocolate bar. She bowed. I don't know what to feel anymore." Acts of feeding became a profound kind of reconciliation, not just for the civilians, but for the occupiers themselves, a chance to reclaim the humanity war had relentlessly scoured from them. Statistics remain staggering. By 1946, over 870,000 tons of food had been imported to Japan through American aid programs. School lunches, initially introduced in Tokyo and subsequently spread nationwide, reached millions of children by 1947. These vital programs provided not only calories but also stability, allowing education to resume in buildings that were often little more than patched-up ruins. Children who had once fainted in class from hunger now lined up for bowls of stew and bread rolls. For them, food became inseparable from learning, survival entwined with the promise of a future. Yet, even as these gestures soothed, they also deepened existing contradictions. Civilians remembered the devastating firebombings that had incinerated entire neighborhoods. They remembered Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where shadows burned into stone told of lives extinguished in an instant. How could the same hands that had dropped fire from the sky now serve nourishing bread and milk? The question haunted adults, less so children, but it lingered in every single bite. One survivor of the Tokyo firebombing recalled, "When my daughter ate American bread, I felt both profound relief and burning anger. They burned my home. Now they feed her. Which is their true face?" The Americans themselves often stumbled in cultural gaps. Spam baffled households. Wheat felt alien compared to familiar rice, and powdered milk left aftertaste children found strange. Still, hunger made even the strangest welcome. And over time, remarkable adaptations occurred. Wheat transformed into noodles, bread into sandwiches, foods that would eventually become staples of a modern Japanese diet. In this way, necessity quietly reshaped culture, each meal a silent negotiation between past identity and present survival. Humor, too, threaded itself into this transformation. In Osaka, children discovered bubble gum and promptly stuck it to their foreheads, assuming it was a decoration. In Tokyo, a grandmother mistakenly believed cocoa powder was soil fertilizer and spread it in her garden, later wondering why it smelled so sweet. These small missteps, fondly remembered with laughter years later, softened edges that might otherwise have cut too deep. They revealed that even amidst utter ruin, people could stumble into moments of levity, proof that life pressed stubbornly forward. The reconciliation was neither instant nor absolute. Distrust persisted, whispered through alleys. They give food today, but what of tomorrow? Yet the consistent presence of meals, the daily repetition of aid, gradually built something sturdier than rumors. Over time, the act of eating foreign food became less an admission of defeat and more a ritual of continuity. Families lived another day. Children grew. Schools hummed with lessons again. And in that rhythm, the image of Americans shifted from conquerors to complicated benefactors. One young man who had been a teenager in 1945 later recalled the transformation. At first, I hated the bread. I hated that it meant we depended on them. But I also hated the hunger more. And slowly I realized I looked forward to it. That confused me. How can you hate and need the same thing? His words perfectly capture the paradox of the moment, the profound conflict that defined post-war Japan. To despise reliance on the enemy, yet to recognize in their food the possibility of survival and even a flicker of hope. As the first full winter after surrender settled over the islands, snow blanketed ruins and cold sharpened hunger further. Relief shipments increased, but so did desperation. Fires were stoked in tin shacks. Bowls passed from hand to hand. Soldiers and civilians encountered each other across the gulf of language and loss. Each encounter carried more weight than the food itself. It was a test of whether former enemies could inhabit the same fragile present. In the ruins, a new kind of story was taking root. One where meals replaced weapons and school lunches replaced battlefields. Yet the tension remained unresolved, as if every bite carried both gratitude and grief. The Japanese people were slowly learning to see their conquerors as something more complex than mere demons. And the Americans were learning that peace could not be enforced by rifles alone. But the most powerful shift was yet to come, one that would turn these scattered gestures into something permanent, transforming not only diets but imaginations. For in the years ahead, food would become not just relief, but a foundation for trust, a bridge between conqueror and conquered that neither side had expected. By 1947, the rhythm of relief had become routine. Ships unloaded sacks of wheat and barrels of powdered milk into Japanese ports, and trucks rumbled through shattered neighborhoods, delivering goods that were once unimaginable luxuries. For children who had grown up in relentless hunger, the sound of a ladle striking the bottom of a pot in a schoolyard was as comforting as the ringing of temple bells once had been. They lined up with dented bowls and wooden spoons, their breath clouding in the winter air, their chatter echoing against walls rebuilt from scrap. Each bowl carried more than soup. It carried the promise that tomorrow might look strikingly different from yesterday. The school lunch program soon became an undeniable lifeline. By 1948, 4 million daily meals became a cornerstone of post-war recovery for Japanese children, a collaborative effort between American aid and local Japanese groups. Wheat rolls replaced traditional rice balls, while steaming hot milk and dishes infused with U.S. surplus foods became indelible childhood memories. Initially, teachers gently coaxed children to eat bread, an alien flavor in a rice-centered culture. Yet, hunger proved a powerful persuader, and within a few years, children eagerly requested more. Many would later laugh, noting their enduring affection for noodles, curry, and bread, now integral to Japanese cuisine, had its roots in those formative post-war meals. Amid these routines, relationships subtly deepened. Civilians who once avoided eye contact with American soldiers began exchanging nods, then words, then cautious laughter. Children followed jeeps, no longer with fear, but with wide-eyed anticipation, waving and shouting for candy. Letters of thanks, penned in shaky hiragana, reached occupation headquarters. One poignant note from a Tokyo boy simply read, "Dear soldier, thank you for bread." I will study hard so I may become strong. The soldier who received this heartfelt message carried it in his wallet for life. This narrative diverged sharply from expectations. Americans had braced for fierce hostility, perhaps guerrilla resistance. Japanese civilians, conversely, braced for cruelty, even enslavement. Instead, what emerged was something far stranger. Compassion, shared amidst the rubble of war. While these acts couldn't erase the trauma of firebombings or atomic shadows, they introduced a new chapter, one where the former enemy was not just a destroyer, but also a provider. This striking contradiction planted the seeds of fragile trust. Still, trust remained complex. Older generations often resisted, clinging to grief that bread alone couldn't soften. Mothers sometimes murmured that food from the enemy felt like a bitter medicine. Fathers warned their children not to grow too fond of the foreigners. Yet, the children themselves were already changing. They giggled, blowing bubbles from chewing gum. They sang songs while clutching loaves of bread. They whispered about soldiers who smiled instead of shouted. For them, America was no longer simply fire from the sky. It was also chocolate in the palm of their hands. Unexpected, small moments of humor helped ease the sharp edges. Children, unfamiliar with American staples, amusingly described peanut butter as sticky candy paste, baffled by its salty sweetness. Grandmothers would sometimes try to serve bread with chopsticks. Soldiers chuckled watching children trade candy for marbles in alleyways, inventing new economies of joy. These tiny, often comical interactions became crucial threads in a resilient fabric of connection, binding two peoples who had previously known each other only through violence. Beyond these interpersonal bonds, a larger ideological transformation was unfolding. The American occupation, guided by MacArthur's staff, was not merely military but fundamentally cultural. Food became its most potent weapon, not wielded with force, but offered with open hands. Nutrition enabled schools to function, creating spaces where ideas could freely circulate. Slowly, a defeated nation began rebuilding, its foundations laid by nourishing meals as much as by policies. Japan's fledgling post-war democracy, initially fragile, grew sturdier in the soil watered by these daily acts of nourishment. The stomach, after all, often serves as the most convincing teacher. Personal testimonies eloquently capture the emotional weight of this shift. A woman from Nagoya vividly recalled, "When my son brought home a piece of bread from school, I held it as if it were treasure. Felt foreign, strange, yet it was life. I thought then that perhaps we would not vanish." Another, from Hiroshima, articulated the stark irony. "The same America that destroyed my city then gave my daughter milk. She drank it every day. She grew tall, taller than I ever imagined. I could not forgive, but I could not deny the truth of that milk." These voices powerfully illustrate the paradox. Reconciliation born not of forgetting, but of the stubborn insistence of survival. Americans too carried enduring memories. Decades later, occupation veterans often spoke not of combat, but of children. One emotionally shared, "I still see their faces when we gave them soup. They bowed so politely even though they were starving. Broke me more than battle ever did." For these soldiers, hardened by war, handing out food offered a pathway back to their own humanity, proof that victory didn't necessitate cruelty. The result wasn't instant friendship, but a gradual knitting of lives once torn apart. The act of feeding created shared spaces where language barriers faltered, but smiles prevailed. In markets rebuilt from rubble, American flour was sold alongside Japanese vegetables. In schools, children recited lessons on democracy between bites of bread. Crucially, the occupation remained marked by power imbalances and quiet resentments. Yet, beneath this surface pulsed the rhythm of meals that couldn't be ignored, holding the seeds of something greater. By the early 1950s, as Japan began its climb toward economic revival, memories of hunger receded but never vanished. Adults who had been children of the occupation carried the strange, unshakable image of American soldiers distributing food in ruined streets. They remembered chocolate melting in mouths, gum sticking to fingers, and bowls of milk steaming in winter air. For many, these cherished memories coexisted uneasily with recollections of bombings, a contradiction they would wrestle with for life. But contradictions can become bridges. The story of Japan and America after the war is not simple triumph or defeat. It is a profound paradox. Kindness sprouted from violence, and survival was offered by those who had delivered destruction. It is a testament to how children, unburdened by adult pride, became the first ambassadors of reconciliation. They tasted the food of their conquerors and discovered not demons but men, not myths but human beings. Perhaps this memory endures so powerfully because it reminds us that even in the darkest aftermath, small, compassionate acts can fundamentally shift the course of nations. A spoon of milk, a square of chocolate, a piece of bread. These were not just calories. They were potent symbols, quiet proofs that compassion can take root in the most unlikely, war-torn soil. The occupation years ended. Japan rose from ruin, and the children who once lined up for soup became adults in a prosperous democracy. Yet, in countless family stories passed down like heirlooms, the moment remains. The day the enemy gave food to their children. It is remembered not as humiliation, but as the strange, tender genesis of something no one had dared to expect. If the world has learned anything from that chapter, it is this. The most lasting victories are not won with fire or steel, but with kindness measured in spoonfuls.